Here's the thing. Most people think starting a podcast is easy. How hard could it be to put a mic in front of yourself and interview someone else about their life or their expertise or whatever else? And I'm here to tell you that as a listener, we know when you know what you're doing and when you don't. The best podcasters know exactly how to prepare to make sure that they're comfortable, their guest is comfortable, and that their listeners are taken care of. If you're new here, my name's Huete. I'm a podcast producer and the creator of the Emerging Voices Podcasting Accelerator. Emerging Voices is where we help aspiring podcasters who are nervous about the tech, overwhelmed by the idea and whether they can actually make it real, or just scared of putting their voice out on the internet. We help them go from that to actually creating a podcast that builds their thought leadership and eventually gets them paid, okay? And if that's you, you'll want to download the 10-step guide to launch your podcast. And if you're wondering why you should trust me, here are a list of the shows that I have helped produce. And in today's video, I'll share the 5 steps that the best podcasters use before they ever hit record to prepare for their interviews. Now, step number 1 is to research like a pro. And it goes without saying that the more prepared you are, the less nervous you'll be. Okay, this is true with a lot of things in life, and podcasting is no exception. As a podcaster, your job is to research in a couple different ways. The first is, you definitely want to research what kinds of questions this person is equipped to answer. You want to be clear on why this person is a good fit for your particular podcast and for your audience. And maybe more importantly than anything, you want to make sure that this person is actually a good guest. Like, do they tell good stories? Are they actually a good conversationalist? So usually this is an issue when it comes to academics or someone who's very good at what they do, but they don't necessarily have practice communicating it. So one of the pieces of research that you want to do is, has this person actually been on another podcast, or have they done a talk, and how do they share their story, or how do they share their research? And once you know that, you know what to expect from them when they come on your podcast. Does that make sense? I hope so. Now, the other piece of this is you want to make sure that you're asking them questions that they haven't been asked before. And this isn't just researching other podcasts that they have been on. It's being really clear first about what it is that you are bringing them on your show to do that's different than what they've done on other shows. So if I had a relationship podcast and I was bringing someone on my show, I know that the show that for example, if we use This Is Dating, because I used it in a last video, with This Is Dating, we are focused on first dates. And we are focused on what does it really take for two people to feel connected? Or we're talking about modern dating and what is wrong with modern dating. If I'm bringing someone on to talk about something like that, I should A, make sure that they're equipped to talk about that. And B, I want to ask them questions that I think our audience really cares about. And yes, that'll involve some research by listening to other podcasts, but really what you first want to think about is, what are you really curious about and what does your audience really need? And then formulate those questions first, and then you can do your research looking at what else they've been asked and make sure there isn't a ton of overlap, because essentially you don't want your listeners to just go to another podcast because it's basically you have the same guests and you're asking the same questions. Okay, so you want to research like a pro by making sure that you know who your guest is, why they're on your show, and then getting super clear on whether they're a good storyteller and what kinds of questions you're going to ask them, what kinds of stories you're going to elicit from them. And if you're making a kind of podcast where it's just fun and it's not necessarily about education or insight, then you really just want to make sure that you know whether the person you're bringing on is actually fun, right? Even if it's not educational, you want to make sure that the guest can fulfill the promise that your podcast is making. Number 2 is to identify the story or the stories that you are most curious about exploring in this episode, okay? So when you go into your interview, you should have a rough idea or a list of questions that you know you're gonna ask or that you think you'll ask. And your job in the interview sometimes is going to be to abandon those questions and actually follow your curiosity if they're in line with the kinds of stories or more interesting stories that come up in the interview. Okay? What you want to make sure though is that you have a beginning, a middle, and an end to your list of interview questions. The reason for this is because your questions are like your anchor. They're the thing that you can always come back to so that you don't feel like you're floating and you're not quite sure where you're going, okay? So just now, a couple hours ago, I interviewed 2 of my past students about their podcast, and I had a list of questions for them. I knew where I was going to start. I knew what kinds of things I'd like to explore with them in the middle. And then at the very end, I knew what I was going to end with. During the actual interview, they started talking about how the hardest part of being a podcaster is learning how to be a good interviewer. And I wasn't planning on digging super deep into that, but that was one of my questions. Like, how did you get better as interviewers for your podcast? And when they brought it up organically, I just followed that thread. And your job as an interviewer is to be clear beforehand what kinds of threads are you most curious about exploring and why. The reason I followed the thread of how they got better as podcasters is because that was one of the stories that I knew I wanted to follow when I was creating my question list. I also knew that that's something that aspiring podcasters who watch this channel are really curious about. If you're curious about that, you can watch the live interview here. And Liz and Christian created a show called What Lingers, and I have to say I'm so proud of them and so excited to watch their progress. Now back to our steps. Even if you're making a very casual or comedic show, I think it's really important that you remember that even if you're not writing a specific list of questions that you're going to be asking, it's very important that you know how to begin the interview, how to take the listeners on a journey so that it's not necessarily a list of random questions. Your listeners should feel like they're getting to either know the person better or know the topic in more nuanced ways or more interesting ways. And then you should be able to land it in a way that feels very helpful and specific. And actually, a trick I use is to always ask a question that you ask on every episode. That will help you land your episode in a very specific way every single time. Now, the third step is to ask questions that open your guest up instead of closing them in, all right? So closing a guest in can happen in a few different ways. If you ask yes or no questions, they're gonna give you yes or no answers. They might try to elaborate, but the question isn't really inspiring them to tell you this beautiful story. They might also close up if you're asking them something that feels intrusive or something they've specifically told you they don't want to ask about, or something that feels like it's not quite related to what you're talking about. That is going to be a closing question. What you want to ask is questions that allow them to open up and paint you a picture, set a scene for you and your listeners so that we can all go to the moment that they're describing. One really easy way you can do that is by asking them about a time when something happened. So tell me about the time when you were deciding to start your business. What was happening in your life that inspired you to do it at that particular point in time? Why was that the right time for you? And they'll be setting a scene for you of what else was happening in their life. They'll be telling you about, had they just graduated? Were they expecting a first child? What was going on? Where were they living? What was happening in their life? And that kind of context, that kind of scene setting really allows for your story to be something that we as a listener can immerse ourselves in and can really engage with. Another way to get your guest to open up is by asking questions that you yourself would confidently answer. And the way that you show them that you would answer this is when you ask the question, you can say something like, I want to ask you about your divorce. And I know that is a really tough subject. As a child of divorce, I can tell you I experienced this, this, and this. And if you're open to it, I would love to hear about your experience with. Okay? And then you can go into your question. I hope that makes sense. Your job is really to think of your guest as a flower that either opens up or that closes. Your job is really to help them open up by creating the right environment for them to do so. And part of that environment is the questions that you use. That brings us to the fourth step, which is how do you prepare your guest for success? Your guest success starts long before you ever hit record for your interview. Some caveats, okay? You don't want to over-prepare your guest by sending them something like a list of questions. I don't know if you know this about me. I don't know if I've said this on this channel. My number one no-no on all things podcasting is don't ever send a guest your complete list of questions. This is because inevitably people will over-prepare and then they'll sound really rigid and stiff when they come on your show. On the other hand, you can be too casual about it and you can not give them enough information and they're not quite sure what they're stepping into or how to really show up in this interview, which will cause them to be a bit more defensive and a bit less open. The smartest thing you can do is to think of yourself as hosting a dinner party for two. It's you and your guest. Now, in order for the two of you to have an interesting conversation and for the dinner to go well, they need to know what to expect. So your job as a podcast host is to tell them the day before and even 48 hours before, maybe even a week before, hey, make sure you come to the podcast knowing that we're going to be recording video and audio. Wear headphones. If you have a microphone, make sure it's connected. We're going to be recording in a virtual studio. This is what the setup is like. This is what you must do before you enter. The more information you can give them, the safer they will feel with you. And the vibe you want to give is you are safe in my hands. I'm a good guide. I'm someone that you can trust, okay? Now, you can absolutely do that through emails, but if you choose to do a pre-interview, I would love that for you. I think that for most people, it just reduces the anxiety significantly for both the guest and for you as the interviewer. And if you want a full video on how to prepare your guest for success, I'm happy to make that because I think that's a necessary tool, but we can talk about that on a separate date. Now, the fifth and final step is to get yourself interview ready, okay? So even if you've done all of this prep and all of this research, if you show up and you're super scattered or you're really rigid and you're just taking notes the whole time and you're not present for the conversation, it's gonna ruin the flow, okay? So we wanna do some fundamental things that get you to be really present and capable of following your curiosity and showing up as a stand-in for your guest. The very first thing you'll want to do is just ground yourself, so your physical body. Are you actually comfortable where you are? Do you feel your feet on the floor? Is your chair comfortable? Have you eaten? Do you need some water? You need to actually ask yourself these questions because your podcast will be significantly better off for you having taken care of your own needs first, okay? The second piece of this is that you want to practice active listening. Instead of just thinking about the next question that you're going to ask, you want to practice the art of listening to someone, taking it in, and seeing if it pulls at a curiosity for yourself. Now, the interview cannot be the only place where you do this. You have to practice this in the rest of your life so that it comes across as a natural skill when you're doing it on your interview. I hope that makes sense. The beauty of this, to me, is that inevitably it's going to make your life so much richer because you're going to become a better conversationalist who can actually ask people interesting questions and who's listening for what people actually have to say instead of just thinking about your point that you want to bring up in response to what this person just said. I would actually say active listening is one of the most underrated skills in podcasting. I think that most people think you just prep a list of questions and show up, but actually a solid 75% of your job is just being present, listening, and responding in a way that allows this conversation to flow. And the more grounded and comfortable you are, the more likely your guest is to open up to you. Because we mirror one another, right? If you're rigid, they're gonna get more rigid. And if you're calm and open, they're gonna get more calm and open. So one of the best things you can do for yourself before you interview someone you're intimidated by or a completely new person that you don't know is to actually interview someone that you're very close to. You can even ask them the exact list of questions that you think you would ask the guest that you're going to record your interview with, but do that same interview with your best friend or your cousin or your parent before you ever do it with the real person. That is going to take the edge off. It's going to make you realize that you can absolutely do this. And when I say you can do this, I really mean it. I'm giving you these tips because I think knowing this helps you prepare and get better over time. And I hope you can come back to this video over and over again and learn something new. But you absolutely can do this. It's just a skill that requires that you put in some reps. Those are your 5 steps to actually preparing like the pros. This is what some of the best interviewers in the world do. And I promise you, if you do it enough times, you'll be well on your way too. So I'm curious, from those of you who've already started recording or who are thinking about recording, what are your go-to rituals for preparing before an interview? How do you calm and ground yourself so that you can show up as your best host self? I want to hear it. Put it in the comments and I will read it and respond. The other piece that I can't remember if I mentioned earlier or not is we actually have a video on how to ask really good questions. So if you haven't watched that, make sure to watch that because I think that will help you significantly in crafting good questions. Now, if you want more from me, make sure to download the 10-step guide to launching your podcast, and I will see you in the next video.